Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy. I am joined here today with David Pearce, who founded the Humanity Plus project and has authored The Hedonic Imperative 1995. So this guy is well versed in whether we should or should not abolish suffering. And so I will be posting in the description a link to abolitionist.com, abolition.com, I think it is.
Abolitionist.com.
Abolitionist.com, which has a podcast which will explain David Pearce's position with greater clarity, where you can say it in his own words and you can find out more about everything that he's going to be discussing today. So today's episode, we will be discussing whether we should abolish pain. So thank you, David, for coming on and welcome.
Thank you, Lewis. It's good to be with you.
So essentially, what would you say would be the aim of abolitionism? Seems to me that it's to abolish suffering, both physical and psychological. Is that the case, and why should we do it?
Yeah, essentially, it's the goal of Gautama Buddha. I teach one thing only: suffering and the end of suffering. The difference now is that biotechnology, AI, actually give us the tools for the job. I mean, not overnight, but in theory, at least, it'd be possible to have, let's say, a 100-year World Health Organization sponsored plan to eradicate suffering throughout the living world. Essentially replacing a signaling system based on traditional pleasure and pain with an information signaling system based on gradients of intelligent well-being and ultimately gradients of intelligent bliss. Now that sounds like science fiction, and certainly the idea of an entire civilization based on information sensitive gradients of bliss is highly speculative. Nonetheless, one can study today's genetic outliers, not merely people who tragically spend their lives chronically depressed, but also people who are hypothymic, who have an extremely high hedonic set point and spend, as I said, these are unusual people who essentially spend their whole lives above hedonic zero. And what essentially I argue is universal access to pre-implantation genetic screening, counseling, CRISPR gene editing, such that essentially, if one does think it is ethically permissible to bring new life and suffering into the world, then essentially, one should choose the genetic makeup of one's children. Yeah. Now, the abolitionist project extends more than to one particular species. I think we should essentially reprogram the biosphere to get rid of suffering throughout the living world. Some of it is technically quite straightforward. Simply shutting down factory farms and slaughterhouses would get rid of perhaps the worst form of readily avoidable suffering in the world today. But thanks to technologies of CRISPR genome editing and synthetic gene drives, it'd be possible actually to extend the abolitionist project across the tree of life.
I mean, that is incredible. I mean, obviously, it's certainly an endeavor that is. It seems as you say, like almost science fiction, as if it could create like a world that was totally genetically modified to remove all negative experiences. And the issue that kind of comes to mind in the first sort of understanding. I would also like to point out, I appreciate the fact that you're vegan and that you obviously want to remove the animal suffering from slaughterhouses and so on, and obviously then looking towards wildlife using CRISPR technology to edit their genes and change the biosphere. The only issue I could see is that would that not create an evolutionary problem where, for example, an animal wouldn't have the ability to adapt and survive in the same way as it would, like through the negative utility of pain?
All sorts of technical problems, but to deal with that point first. Essentially, what's critical to functioning well isn't your absolute point on the hedonic scale, but essentially there should be gradations. It's important to retain informational sensitivity to good and bad stimuli. And just as there are some tragically depressive people or people with neuropathic pain who endure chronic depression, chronic pain, but at least in most cases, they nonetheless at least show some sensitivity to bad and less bad stimuli. Likewise, there are organisms, people at the other extreme. Before literally attempting to get rid of all pain, all mental and physical pain altogether, though, I mean, the sensible thing to do is to choose benign genetic variants. And for example, in my paper on the use of synthetic gene drives, I focus, for example, on this, one particular gene. The SCN9A gene has been described as the volume knob of pain. And just as with humans, it would be possible to choose benign variants of the gene. Dozens have been discovered. Nonsense mutations of SCN9A abolish not just pain but nociception, and at least for now we don't want that. It's vital to maintain functional sensitivity to noxious stimuli, but essentially other alleles of SCN9A confer unusually high or low pain thresholds. And one thing one can do with synthetic gene drives is one can push benign genetic variants across an entire species. Now, as I said, we would start with humans, then tackle large terrestrial vertebrates, and then go on across the tree of life, obscure marine invertebrates, rodents and the like. But in practice, at least in theory at any rate, synthetic gene lives allow one to invert this chronology with sexually reproducing fast breeders. Before embarking on some grandiose species project to reprogram the biosphere, one would start off with self-contained artificial biospheres. Gene drives are going to be used first in practice to defeat vector-borne disease like malaria. Essentially, gene drives, they cheat the laws, what are naively the laws of Mendelian inheritance. They offer a form of biased inheritance so that you can push desired genes, allelic variations across an entire population. And if you can, for example, ensure that all offspring of genetically modified mosquito are of one gender, let's say male or female, essentially one can drive a species of Anopheles mosquito extinct. But gene drives can also be used for other purposes too. Essentially, the level of suffering in the biosphere is shortly going to become an adjustable parameter, and we're going to be able to essentially choose what approximate level of suffering in nature is optimal.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Essentially, it'd be like choosing if you think of it as a volume knob, as you say, and let's say the volume knob normally goes from, let's say like 1 to 10. You could start off from something like 5 and then maybe even go to 15 or something like that, changing the hedonic treadmill so that you're not limited to a certain point, and maybe you don't actually hit that 0 point anymore, that like 1 point where it's unbelievably low and you feel that chronic depression or chronic pain, as you say. But I guess this is the issue, because there seems to me that there is a focus on the modification of an individual to not feel physical pains, like physical parameters of pain, and that seems to be related to one's neurochemistry. But how would one modify someone to not feel psychological pain, especially when we say that there has to be a prevalence of metaphysical variance so that we can differentiate within that scale, within that 1 to 10 or 5 to 10. There still has to be that variation so that we can have a functioning a functioning society, a functioning individual even. So then they're not, as you say, like wire-headed individuals who maybe just want to feel like a form of like orgasmic dopamine release on a constant kind of high. So in that case, would that not would the psychology of an individual not reattribute the positive and negative experiences to these new new levels, these new variations? Would we not simply see that the depressed people would start at 5 and still have chronic depression, whilst the most happy people would maybe then only be that same way if they hit 15? What do you think?
I mean, intuitively, you're right. This captures a very common, popular, and strong intuition that, in some sense, pleasure and pain, in the broadest sense, are relative. But nonetheless, just as there are people who are chronically depressed and go through life experiencing gradations of misery, equally there are people who spend most, if not all, their life above hedonic zero, and that by ratcheting up hedonic set points and hedonic range, one can keep informational sensitivity to good and bad stimuli. Now, unlike the so-called volume knob for pain, one can't point to a single a gene that is the kind of volume knob for mental pain. Nonetheless, already molecular biologists, following up on original twin studies, have been able to identify particular genes, alleles, allelic variants, and combinations associated with having a high hedonic set point. And in principle, at any rate, one can use this knowledge to load the genetic dice and ensure future children essentially are temperamentally extremely happy and hyperthymic. As I said, it's worth studying systematically today's hedonic outliers. Now, there are some people who are, though it's quite a rare syndrome, unipolar euphoric mania. Now, that isn't what one wants to induce. However, there are other people who are extremely high functioning, high hedonic set point, and they're essentially can enjoy very high default quality of life in under a regime of natural selection and traditional sexual reproduction. Nature just kind of plays with the dial, so to speak, and in certain circumstances a depressive temperament has been fitness enhancing, and in other contexts being temperamentally optimistic. But we're probably on the brink of a new kind of selection pressure, because as this kind of reproductive revolution of designer babies unfolds, no longer have you got blind natural selection based on effectively random genetic variations. Instead, you're going to have intelligent agents actually choosing the genetic makeup of their kids in anticipation of the likely effects of their choices. So it's a very different kind of selection pressure when one has conscious agents taking these decisions. Now, I'm making a lot of assumptions here. As you know, we have had the first designer babies in China. It's generated a lot of controversy. Rather than attempting to enhance subjective well-being, the scientist in question he was nominally trying to confer resistance to HIV. In practice, given the genetic modification in question, if used in so-called animal models, actually boost memory and cognitive performance. He was probably actually trying to create smart babies, smart kids. But that's why I think we need a debate, as assuming that antinatalists are wrong and that it is ethically permissible to create new life, inevitably for now at least, new suffering without prior consent of the experiment, the sentient genetic being in question, then should we just leave it to nature, to traditional blind genetic crapshoot, or should we actually load the genetic dice in our kids' favor? And a lot of the focus has been on, what about, enhancing intelligence? But on a purely ethical level, I think it's most urgent to enhance well-being, or at least remedy a predisposition to ill-being.
I think I would agree. I think in many ways, I think that the idea of I think we do err on the side of caution with these things, maybe too much, especially when we talk about the reduction of suffering. I couldn't think of something especially more ethically relevant when you think of, how many beings are suffering today in even in the wildlife. If you look at if you're a mouse that gets ripped apart by a fox, I mean, the idea of that outcome is somewhat unpleasant. So, to say the least. So, to help reduce the impacts of suffering to individuals would be immensely powerful. And I know that many antinatalists even would say that if they could, they would destroy all life rather than have and abolish all suffering simply because it is that bad. I mean, I don't agree with that principle. I think Benatar's wrong, and I think Julio Cabrera does a great job at showing why the asymmetry argument doesn't follow. But I do think that the antinatalists have raised an important question, which is whether we should reproduce given the amounts of suffering in the world today, whether it's the right course of action to do. And it's kind of brought this ethical quandary to the forefront of society, which I think is great. I think that the only issue I can see here is and it's quite a popular reference perhaps. Have you seen the film Gattaca before?
I have indeed, yes.
Yeah. What happens when we genetically engineer children, for example, and then the standard becomes genetically engineered or nothing, where the ethics of the society is now impacted with the implications of genetic engineering, whether someone's social status is now tied into the normative structure of being genetically engineered, and also especially when we consider that if we do it through gene drives, the idea in Gattaca is this who you're going to reproduce with. And if someone has better outcomes based on the genetic propensities that they've been birthed with, does this not create a form of perhaps elitist hierarchical systems, perhaps even related to capital? And there's so many political outcomes that this could influence, where you could have, let's say, a class of genetically superior beings, or you could have you could have class warfare based on genetically superiority, and you could have all these different outcomes in general. And so how would we approach such a thing where there's such ambiguity as towards whether it will actually promote happiness and well-being, or whether it could promote perpetual suffering in relation to ethical and political outcomes?
Yeah, it's best to, because a rule of thumb, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Let's assume that strong antinatalism, i.e. extinctionist antinatalism, is untenable. The very nature of selection pressure means that simply not having kids or adopting essentially simply intensifies selection pressure against any predisposition to antinatalism. So yeah, let's assume that we agree in some sense that it is ethical to have children, whatever one's reservations. I think one thing is, any child born today is a genetic experiment. So it's not a case of are we going to engage in risky genetic experimentation or not. It's what kind of experimentation we want to practice, whether the traditional blind genetic experimentation of sexual reproduction, or whether we're actually going to try to direct evolution and choose the makeup of our kids. Okay, on to your question though. What kind of traits do we want to genetically select for? Hedonic set points and hedonic range aren't like something like income or wealth, which tend to be tend to be relative. If you get a 50% pay rise, chances are you'll feel discontented and cheesed off if your fellow workers get 100% pay rise, for example. But nonetheless, if you have your hedonic set point decided or raised by a comparable amount, essentially everyone benefits. And this is absolutely critical. But by ratcheting up hedonic set points, hedonic range, crudely speaking, everyone is a winner. One isn't adjudicating between conflicting preferences. One isn't trying to construct a kind of ideal society or utopia. It's just ensuring that future children essentially are temperamentally happy and healthy. As well as mood, pain sensitivity, what about intelligence? Well, as I said, I'm personally a great skeptic about something like IQ tests, for example. I think they measure only the autistic component of general intelligence. And if people start trying to have high IQ kids, essentially what they'll be having is kids who are higher on the autistic Asperger's spectrum, which may or may not be desirable. There needs to be a debate about this, but I think essentially one needs to have a much richer conception of intelligence than one finds today in this.
I couldn't agree more. After doing an IQ test, I was actually quite surprised. I don't really feel like it measures it. I think I did quite well, but I think at the same time, what I did find is that it only measures certain aspects of intelligence, and it's more about agility as well. So it's more how fast you think in certain scenarios, which can be impeded by so many different things. And to measure intelligence like that does seem a bit silly, more than anything.
Essentially, they're simple-minded. I mean, one of the things that drove the evolution of distinctively human intelligence is our capacity for cooperative problem solving, mind reading skills, yet IQ tests are mind blind. As I said, they do test one particular a facet or component of intelligence, so-called, or the autistic component. But it would be extremely difficult to start ratcheting up intelligence. Essentially there are thousands and thousands of allelic variations that play a subtle role, particularly if one is speaking casually and informally, on a podcast rather than writing a scientific paper. It's easy to sound like a crude genetic determinist, which I'm not. I mean, there are ways in which one could really be creating geniuses, someone like von Neumann, who's he's buried at Princeton. One could create multiple clones with variations, hothouse them in some kind of recursive cycle of self-improvement. But I mean, this isn't my focus. This isn't what the abolitionist project is about. It's essentially about minimizing, preventing, and mitigating suffering. So though one can have fascinating discussions as to what the long-term future of transhuman intelligence is going to be. Nonetheless, it's not central to the abolitionist project.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting, especially because the focus on intelligence would then, obviously, there comes the utility of intelligence that you could then understand the process even better and perhaps even improve upon the project in the future. But at the same time, it comes with its own drawbacks. If we don't understand intelligence now, how can we say what is more or less intelligent? And it kind of reminds us of that Alan Watts conversation on, if someone said, ask them that we are going to make genetically engineered super beings, what should we make? And he's like, I have no idea, because he's like, all I know is have the greatest range possible. And I think that adds something to it, as if there was an ethical issue with the idea of subjectively placing out and idealizing individual subjects in the first place. It comes with its own drawbacks. And I think that like that can be expressed in and I would argue as a Hegelian, the necessary institutionalization of ethics being a social construct, something that already impacts between one being to another, which kind of brings us on to the next well, this relationship and this idea of social connectivity, which kind of brings us on to the next point. You talked about essentially, the intelligence even being a social skill, and then you also said that when we talk about well-being, we can also talk about how there are certain aspects of our being which are maybe that we could selectively improve. So, do you think would it be beneficial to improve something like, rather than improve, let's say, if we could, and believe me, I have no idea about the physical feasibility of most of this. I think you are far more qualified in this than me. So, would it be possible to improve something like altruistic joy in a Buddhist sense, or an ethical sense, and that way you would increase cooperation and prevent something like Gattaca from forming, where you have social tensions and social issues, which would form because of discontentment with one social position in relation to another. Of course, we'll not talk about how this could then be used to create a slave class, but it is obviously then possible to create a greater ethical connectivity between people. Would that be plausible, or?
Yes, I mean, what I'm going to see today is something like, a drug like MDMA, ecstasy, which is short acting, but nonetheless, it's an empathetic, euphoriant hug drug.
Yeah.
Essentially, essentially, induces a sense of I love the world and the world loves me. Very, very different form of augmentation from when one thinks of post-human superintelligence, one normally imagines some kind of austere super Asperger, whereas one could be enhancing something like spontaneous social cognition and empathy. One needs to be quite cautious here, because is this a form of moral enhancement? Because a lot of moral behavior consists of being, crudely speaking, a hypersystematizer, an autistic rule follower. I'm using the term autistic in a value neutral way, in the sense that, if one is full of love and empathy for someone, one is likely to be nepotistic. Whereas certainly if you're a legislator, but perhaps more generally, part of being ethical is being impartial. It's being an effective altruist. This is one reason why effective altruists, utilitarians, they will tend on the whole to be male, who hypermasculine, essentially higher on the autistic scale. So in terms of actually being able to kind of find grain genetic interventions, that is probably further down the line. But yes, in principle, one can create people who one is selecting not just for IQ but AQ, with AQ being autism or Asperger's quotient. Yeah.
I feel like as well we'd also need a greater amount of ethical knowledge, and something that is not present in today's society, perhaps with the death of many ethical institutions and the lack of replacement available to those institutions, with spiritualism and religion being perhaps one of the most common places of ethical discussion now, like kind of disappearing from society, and ethical discussion being only present upon the other institutions which have been left. And then obviously you've got things like capital and social capital, which have obviously impacted that, and socialists have certainly criticize a Hegelian like myself because of this. The biases that are present within the system itself will obviously reflect whatever ethical kind of system we're trying to create in the future, so we'll kind of reproduce whatever we have again and again and again. So that is an issue as well. So whatever we do choose to enhance might reflect a systemic bias. Even if we are truly democratic, we might still have a systemic bias, and so there's that issue as well. And I guess like this is as much, I really do find it incredibly interesting. I mean, and one of the things is, like, obviously you said, like, effective altruism. It's almost as if we would need like an objectivity to that as well. You can't be a purely loved up human being, because you might be, you might even not be considerate of yourself within the equation as well. So it seems like even altruism requires almost a proper understanding of self-value. And I think people like to forget, like they think that ethics is a form of like moral slavery. It's like, no, it should be your freedom in the first place. And I think that's the Hegelian stance. And then that comes with the rule following and the deontological system, which allows you to become free from your own implicit preferences and your own biases. So I think that's incredibly interesting. I appreciate you talking about that. I guess the next point would be informs in relation to whether we actually could find out whether we've made things better or worse. So once we've done it, let's say we were to communicate with a designer human being, and we've created a being who we think should have perhaps higher levels of pleasure and lower levels of pain, both psychological and physical. How could we communicate whether that is the case if the range is still equal? Because we would have to obviously allow the individual to have a full range of emotional states and a full range of physical states, which it could differentiate. And it would only be able to understand those states within reference to each other metaphysically as a contrast. So 1 to 10 would still exist, but on a higher range on the scale. So how would we communicate whether their 1 is equal to our 10 and our 10 is equal to their 1? How would we be able to kind of bridge that communicative gap? Because it seems to be present in the notion of qualia in the first place, the ineffability of self-evident being.
Yeah, I mean, there are, as you know, sort of deep philosophical issues. How can one actually understand, know another sentient being? Can one even know anyone else but oneself is conscious at all? Though this problem of other minds is sometimes thought to be insoluble, I don't actually think this is the case. One can look at, well, it's a unique example, the Hogan sisters, craniopagus twins, who share a thalamic bridge, and partially at least they can experience each other's thoughts and feelings, what the other is seeing. And in principle, it would be possible in future, and this is truly transhumanist technology, for us to have reversible thalamic bridges, so we could do the equivalent of a Vulcan mind meld. But one doesn't need to go on to this kind of speculative transhumanist stuff. One can just see if the behavioral, the neuroscientific, the molecular biological, the pharmacological evidence converges, and it does. And one can essentially look at today's people who are hypothalamic. I most commonly cite my transhumanist colleague Anders Sandberg, who, when pressed, acknowledged, I do have a ridiculously high hedonic set point. And this is someone who is socially responsible, works in academia, not least in the field of existential risk. I mean, naively, one imagines that people who are temperamentally extremely happy would be reckless risk takers, and though some of them are, other things being equal, the more you love life, the more you want to preserve it. I mean, to some extent, if one is temperamentally extremely happy person, one thinks of it as normal, and one probably doesn't really fully appreciate and understand the rich hedonic tone. If one has, and this is very stylized and schematic, but if you do think of the hedonic range of Darwinian life as, let's say, -10 to 0 to +10, with -10 being absolute ghastliness, the worst agony or despair, +10 sublime peak experiences. Most people probably just a little bit above hedonic 0 on average for their hedonic set point. Other people, of course, the large minority of depressives who spend much of their life below hedonic 0. But there are other people whose typical hedonic set point is, +7 or a +8. Some people tend to be pretty equable. They don't fluctuate much. Other people are more sort of volatile, mercurial, up and down. In extreme cases, you get sort of by various forms of bipolar disorder. But essentially, nature plays with the dials, and we can shortly, at any rate, yes, we will be taking on these kind of godlike powers.
I think it's very important to recognize as well, as you say, that any kind of reproduction comes with its own risk, in the sense that there will be it's not as if the risk isn't necessarily in the genetic engineering, and that could be a risk mediation, as it's trying to control the risk of reproduction, because it is reproduction itself which is obviously moving the dials. You're just trying to make sure that they don't move too far one way. Which is very interesting, I think, in that. And it seems to me that most people's critique of genetic modification is this idea of risk. But what if we make things worse? And it's like, well, it might just genuinely end up worse anyway. Like, people can be born into horrible genetic deformities, both physiological and neurological, that could overall create a lot of harm within their lives. And I think that's very important to recognize that we may be intervening for the positive in that respect. I think I suppose obviously you say, like, with the hard problem of consciousness, almost this idea, like, kind of contacting another individual, obviously that has to be resolved for any ethical system anyway. Like, for me to be able to consider your interests, I do have to make implicit assumptions upon your behavior and upon the overall evidence that I can achieve through my sense data, that you are experiencing a certain level of pain and pleasure in reference to certain actions. Like, I assume that when you burn your hand, it's not the same as me, like, let's say you burn your hand on like a hot piece of metal. That's not the same as me, let's say, having a paper cut, and that those two are comparable for me to understand social interaction anyway, so that I know that it would be better for me to get a paper cut than you to, let's say, like, get a 3rd-degree burn. And obviously these are implicit within sociological interactions anyway, like, rather even without the notion of genetic engineering actually even coming into play. Like, so I guess this communicative feature of pain and pleasure is already taken as a given. So why has it become so prevalent when we talk about genetic modification?
Yeah, I mean, to the best of our knowledge, there is no one with an inverted pleasure-pain axis, whereas in theory, at any rate, and I stress the theory, we don't know any reason why one couldn't have, let's say, an inverted color spectrum or something like that. And that seeming counterexamples to this claim about the pleasure-pain axis. I mean, masochists, for example, don't really refute it. It's simply that masochists undergo a kind of release of intensely rewarding endogenous opioids in response to stimuli that most people would find either painful or humiliating. So essentially, yeah, it seems to be a universal feature of sentient life evolved under pressure of natural selection, the pleasure-pain axis. I think the issue of consent crops up a lot, but essentially, complications aside, no one wants to be harmed. And this is true of humans and non-humans alike. So essentially, we are shortly going to be in position to ensure that no sentient being is harmed against his or her will.
Yeah, and it seems to me that we wouldn't talk about consent if we're saying, like, nobody says, like, I didn't consent for you to push me out of, like, out of that fire. Thank you for saving me. And it seems that consent is normally the interjection of an individual who might be trespassing upon someone's sovereignty or individuality, subjectivity itself. And so what we really talk about is how to mitigate harm in the first place. It's as if my will would be respected. My consent is actually being respected if you interject upon my behalf in order to save me from a problem that I could not save myself. And that's kind of the point of ethics in the first place, this idea of social cooperation, rather than, like, stark individuality, and this idea of libertarian free will that, I mean, libertarian in the political sense, where it's my land, my property, don't you come on out, I'll shoot you. Yeah, it is intuitive to at least think that the idea of consent in this respect would actually be respected if we were mitigating the harm against an individual. And I think that's great. I think that's a good point. I think right. I think that's almost, I think, all of the questions that I had prepared for the most part. I think obviously when it comes to the the physical parameters of this endeavor, I'm very unqualified. So anyone who's watching who is saying, Lewis, but you didn't question him about this piece of biological data, I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea. But philosophically, I find that your argument's quite compelling. I think especially the idea that we're already rolling the dice with reproduction. And I can't help agree with many antinatalists on that point when they say, like, well, are we not taking an unnecessary risk in reproducing an individual who could suffer like greatly? And I have to agree that I don't think that it's a necessarily, I don't think their argument is asymmetrical. And I would, disagree with Benatar. But at the same time, I am compelled to think that this is an ethical decision-making process, an ethical quandary that we have to consider. And so, if we're going to be rolling the dice, at least we should, try and load the dice if we can. So I think that it's very interesting. I think the issues are obviously come to the point of like what happens if, for example, China in its state ethic, latches onto this technology and we haven't banned it in the first place, because it seems like a uniform ban is the only thing that we could do to police another nation into preventing like certain certain genetic modifications which would be beneficial to the state. For example, a slave class of individuals who don't feel pain, or for example, genetically modifying a type of animal which would maybe be have no pain receptors. Do you think it would be ethical to, let's say, kill an animal and like a not like and then consume them if we genetically modified them to have no pain receptors so that they weren't able to suffer from being slaughtered? Or
It's the same. Would it be permissible to raise orphaned human babies for the purpose, or
yeah
anencephalic babies and so on? I think essentially one needs taboos, and that even if is it wrong to eat a human who is, let's say, roadkill? It's best to have a taboo against cannibalism. Likewise with non-human animals, rather than trying to mitigate the cruelties of factory farming and slaughterhouses. I think we need a moral revolution, a shift to systematically helping sentient beings rather than harming them. Now, that sadly probably sounds very dreamy, utopian, which is why I think it's critical that we accelerate the development and commercialization of cultured meat.
I completely disagree. I think that doesn't sound utopian at all. I mean, I'm a vegan already, so I can't speak for everyone. But it seems to me that when we say that it's utopia, I think that the issue is even with all of this technology, everything that we're given and available, there seems to be this idea of like the state ethic and the ethic of the contemporary society. This being a tool, every tool can be misused, and every tool has its own implicit functions that are applicable to the greater good of society. And that's the whole point about intelligence anyway. Intelligence is it's an instrumental to human good. It's not a good in and of itself. And I think that veganism offers an institutional opportunity, for example, for mutual ethical cooperation and conversation to finally develop once again in society, because I think that it kind of diminished as the point as and cultural nihilism has almost started to take foot in, especially in post-capitalistic society, in my opinion. But, even if we see the death of religions and the removal of certain institutions, and perhaps this offers an opportunity for us to redevelop ethically again and hopefully improve upon our ethics so that we can then better use these tools and function in the best way possible. But then it seems that we'll have to focus on, let's say, not just a national ethic or individual an individual, maybe then a community ethic, and then a national ethic, and then we need to think about a global ethic now, and how other countries like China would then use technology. I think I watched it. I think they didn't make some sort of human pig recently, where they were trying to work out for organ transplants, and it seems to me that any society that would be okay with producing, although they say that it wouldn't be sentient and so on. The only and that this was, I think, was killed before it was born, but that would be okay with producing such things would be then okay with producing, let's say, a slave class of individuals. And I think that they already have that slave class, and if they could modify through genetic drives to then propagate certain certain
Yeah,
properties,
I
they
think
might be able to do that.
yeah, it's been speculated this idea of warriors who don't feel pain, but any
Mhm.
future wars unlikely to be fought by soldiers, more likely to be done by robots and AI. Certainly, looking a
I
few
completely agree.
decades ahead. Now, as I said, I've resisted the temptation to go into my ideas for world peace or anything like that. I've tried to stay focused, but that is one particular worry. I don't think we need to dwell on unduly, shall we say, this creation of a warrior caste of soldiers.
See, the warrior class, I think, is probably unlikely, as you say, with the AI. And I think that full automation probably does the same thing to the worker class. Why would China genetically engineer a bunch of workers when it could simply just, pre-program a robot to do the same thing 100 times faster? I don't think that genetic engineering is going to make work as proficient at certain menial tasks as automation is in the first place. So I don't think we need to actually worry so much about this. Eventually, the push and pull economic factors will probably push China towards automation as well. And perhaps if we can, create a more socially diverse system in which people are perhaps more content with their lives, they might be less greedy anyway, and we won't have to worry about capitalism because it'll sort itself out. So there's so many things to consider in this. And so I really thank you for the opportunity more than anything to have this discussion, and obviously just to raise the questions more than anything. And obviously, whatever the audience are thinking, like conclusion-wise, you probably assumed before the start of it, but I'd certainly suggest checking out abolitionist.com and listening to David's podcast on the feasibility and the overall implications of genetically modifying humanity and the possibility of designer drugs and wireheading as well. Although you did seem quite against wireheading, I think that was like the perhaps the lowest valued option.
I think wireheading ought to be available as an option because, I don't think any victim of intractable depression who has tried all the antidepressants today should be forced to suffer. But nonetheless, for society as a whole, it doesn't seem to be viable. Just as there is selection pressure against antinatalism, there will be selection pressure against wireheading. Just wireheading, intracranial self-stimulation of what used to be called the pleasure centers, though in fact they're more aptly called the desire centers. But this is not what I'm urging as a viable solution to the problem of suffering.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, especially the idea of maybe perhaps some of these methods being used to be even just simple treatments for certain things that will have no other solution for, even in a even in a temporary sense, until like obviously medical methodologies improve, which is an amazing concept. Obviously, we'll see how things go because obviously where society's going, I don't know how. Obviously, I think Robert Nozick kind of brings this up. This idea of like the idea of producing someone to be almost in that experience machine. People tend to have a drive to want to be connected to reality, and that's one of the desires that they seek to be filled. But perhaps that's just a situation bias. But it's hard to tell, and it also raises implications of addiction and so on.
Well, this is one advantage of hedonic recalibration is that it's not going into an experience machine. You can keep your core values and preference architecture. It's just your quality of life, your default is immeasurably richer. Whereas, going into an experience machine involves, loss of contact with consensus reality.
Yeah, and it seems to me that as well, like this as well, like I hadn't even thought about genetically engineering individuals to have a communicative experience together. Like obviously the idea of making someone that experiences well-being in relation to others would promote an ethical system as well that was then self-sustainable, rather than perhaps being more like on the wireheading. It's very individualistic and perhaps one could lose oneself into the pleasure of it all. But to have pleasure as a mutually gained experience then removes the notion of loss of touch of reality, which is, I would argue, inherently social. So it's a really good idea. It's very interesting. And thank you very much for coming on today, David. And I do recommend everyone check out his book, The Hedonist Imperative, 1995, and abolitionist.com, and also Humanity Plus. So, and I'll also link your Twitter in the description as well, David. So if you want to tweet them and just say this was a load of rubbish, you're absolutely wrong, don't do that. Tweet at me. And just if you've got any questions at all, just leave them in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to hopefully approach them. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Lewis. It's been great being on the show. Thank you.
Thank you.